going to multiply binomials today, and we're going to first define what a binomial is. So when I'm looking at the word binomial, this part right here, this word nomial, well, that implies term. And this prefix bi, well, that means two. So when I'm talking about a binomial, I'm talking about things that have two terms. And when I'm looking at these parenthesis groups over here, I can say, well, this is one term and this is two terms. So that polynomial is considered a binomial. And then if I'm looking at this other parenthesis group, make that smaller. So if I'm looking at this other parenthesis group and say this term and this term, well, I've got two terms in that second parenthesis group. So when I'm multiplying binomials, it's just the way I'm saying that I'm multiplying something with two terms by another thing with two terms. So that's what this is called. When I'm multiplying, what I'm doing is distribution. So when I'm doing distribution, what I have to remember is that I multiply the coefficients and I add the powers. Like, that's how I do distribution. So I'm going to multiply this binomial by that binomial using distribution twice. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say I'm going to distribute this through this second group. And then after that, I'm going to distribute this through that second group. So I'm distributing twice. So I'm going to write that down. So that's going to look like. So when I decide that I'm going to distribute this 3x through all this stuff, I'm going to write it down like this. I have 3x, and I'm going to distribute that through all of the second group. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to distribute the second term in the first group, so this -2, through all this stuff. And so I'm going to write that down and say I've got a -2 that I'm distributing through that second parenthesis group. So I'm just writing it down. Okay. When I'm doing distribution, right, I'm going to go here and then there. That's how it works when we distribute. I am using the concept that I'm going to multiply the coefficients and then I'm going to add the powers. Okay. So what I'm going to do first is multiply the coefficients, and I'm going to do that in blue here. I'm going to say the coefficient of 3 times 5, well, that's going to give me 15. But then what I want to do is add the powers on the variables, and our variables are missing their powers. So if there's nothing written down, it's assumed that they're 1. And so now I'm going to add the powers on those two terms and say I'm going to do that in black. I've got x, and I'm adding 1 plus 1, and that gives me 2. Okay. Now I'm going to multiply the coefficients in the next part. So when I'm distributing this part right here, I am multiplying this 3 by this 8. So I'm going to make that 8 blue because I'm multiplying the coefficients. Okay, so 3 times 8 is going to be 24. And this guy has an x part to it, but this one does not. So I just write down what I have, and I have this x to the power of 1. Okay, so that's the first distribution. Then I'm going to distribute in the second one, and I'm going to write the little arrows underneath just because I have room down there. And so I'm going to distribute here, and I actually think I'm going to change that color, keep it consistent. I'm going to distribute here, and then I'm going to distribute there, and I'm always multiplying. I'm multiplying the coefficients, and then I'm adding the powers on the variables. Okay, so I'm going to multiply the coefficients. So I'm going to multiply my -2 times my 5, and that's going to give me 10. And this guy doesn't have an x term, but this guy does. And he really has an x to the power of 1. So I'm going to write down that I really have this x to the power of 1 because I had nothing else to add it to. So I'll make that green just so it's sort of consistent. Then I'm going to multiply this coefficient with that coefficient. So I'm multiplying that -2 times my +8 here, and that's going to give me a -16, and neither of these have any x's in them, so this doesn't have any x's in it either. The last thing I need to do is combine like terms, and when I'm looking for like terms, they have the same power on the variable. And the only two that have the same power on the variable are these two. This one has a power of 2, right? There's a power of 2 on this, and this one doesn't have an x term or x part to it, the term at all. So I'm only able to combine like terms where they both have that x to the 1, okay? So I'm going to write down the answer. I'm going to say, well, I have 15x squared. And then when I combine like terms, oh, I should have written my negative in here. I have 24 and negative 10, which is negative 14x. And I have a negative 16. So that's my answer. Okay. All right, so the next one, we're doing the same thing. We're going to multiply the coefficients and add the powers. So that means that I'm going to multiply, I'll do this. I'm going to distribute twice, so I'm going to multiply, I'll do this. I'm going to distribute this by this, and I'm going to write down I have a 4x squared times 3x plus 1, and then I'm going to multiply this 6 times all this stuff. So I'm going to say I have 6 times 3x plus 1, right? Distribution twice. And I'm going to multiply my coefficients and I'm going to add my powers. I'm going to put in powers where they're missing. That makes my life a little easier. So I can add my powers, and then I'm going to color my coefficients as I go and say I'm multiplying the coefficients, right? I'm multiplying the coefficients first. So this is going to give me 4 times 3, which is 12. And then when I am doing my variables, I'm adding my 2 and my 1. So I'm going to get this x to the 2 plus 1, which is going to be 3. Okay. Then I'm going to multiply my coefficients. So I've done my distribution here, and now I'm going to distribute here, and I'm going to get my 4 times my 1, and that's going to give me 4. But this term doesn't have an x in it, only this one does. So I just write down that I have this x to the power of 2 from the term I'm distributing through. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to distribute this 6 times this 3x and then this 6 times this 1. And so I'm going to multiply the coefficients of 6 times 3, and that's going to give me 18. This doesn't have an x term or x part to the term in it, and this does. So I'm just going to write down what I have in that 3x to the 1. So I'm going to write down my x to the 1. And then I'm going to multiply this 6 times this 1. And so I'm going to say, well, I have 6 times 1, which is going to give me positive 6. Okay. What I'm doing next is combining like terms, and like terms mean that they're going to have the same power on the variable, so I can combine them together. And this has a power of 3, this has a power of 2, this has a power of 1, and this doesn't have an x term or x part to the term at all. So I cannot combine any of these together. So I'm going to write it down and say, well, I've really got 12x to the third and 4x squared plus 18x plus 6. And that's my answer.